very much, Alina, and thank you, everybody, for coming. The title of this panel is Compass Point, and we're trying to understand Europe's tech and security priorities. And we'll bring our guests on stage in one moment. I think that it speaks to what SEPA tries to focus upon much of the time, which is that overlap between technology policy, security policy. That's what this conference is about. That's what the events we've been hosting have been about. That's many of the conversations we've been having and the reports that we write. So hopefully the group that we bring up today will shed a bit of light on what's happening here, and we'll talk a little bit about what the implications are for the transatlantic relationship and what's happening today in that sense. So I might welcome our panel on stage. When we just be careful with the step with everybody coming up. We're all helpfully labelled where everyone's going to sit. So I'll make very, very quick introductions and forgive the mangling of names. I'm Ronan, I can pronounce my own name most of the time, but for everyone else, we're joined by the Director of the Digital Society Trust and Cybersecurity in DG Connect, and that is Christiane Kirketerp de Viron. Hope you did okay there. I'll skip down to your fellow Dane, Casper Klynge from Zscaler has joined us. We have Tomi Huhtanen from the Wilfred Martens Centre here in Brussels, so many of you will be familiar with Tomi. And last but by no means least is SEPA Senior Fellow Lucinda Creighton, also a former Minister in the Irish Government, responsibility for European Affairs, and leads her own consultancy here and in Dublin, Vulcan Consulting. And Christiane, I'm going to come to you first, if I may. DG Connect, how do you balance Europe's quest for innovation, for competitiveness? We have Compass Point in the title for a reason. There is a plan in place. How do you balance that against the European joy in regulation, shall we say?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very hot topic these days. Indeed it is. So I think the starting point for us is always, of course, to also remind people that if there's a European joy for regulation, it's also because we really want to avoid having 27 different regulations, right? We have an internal market. So when we make European rules, it is in a way a good start to actually already help us have an internal market for our companies that want to sell throughout the Union and not deal with 27 different regimes. Then, of course, the key thing when we regulate, I think, it's to do it in a way that's proportionate, risk-based, etc. And this is a job. I work on cybersecurity, as you said. And in my field, we've been very busy. Let's be honest. We've been very busy regulating because we have seen that there is a need to also raise security standards within our critical entities, in our products, etc. Now, on the one hand, I think it's important when, of course, we do this regulation, and importantly, when we implement it, that we give space to our industry, that we bring our industry on board. And I heard also before we were talking about the standards, because I think for me, the standards is really the key place where we bring our regulation to life for our industry, but where we also work very closely with our industry for them to be able to also define, help us define what actually regulation means in practice. The other thing is, of course, that, innovation, you also need money for it. And I think we heard a little bit before also around how do we create our industry around it. I like to go around and remind people that with our cyber frameworks, we're creating a gigantic market opportunity for cybersecurity companies, for managed security services, for everyone who's operating in the security field, because all our critical entities now need to do proper cybersecurity, and they will not be doing that on their own. So we're creating a market here, and I think it's important that when we're creating this market, we're also conscious about, what do we need to support a European industry developing around this? Do we have what it takes in terms of having a cybersecurity industry in Europe? Where are the gaps, etc.? So these are things that we need to sort of match together in the package. And then, of course, I wouldn't be sitting where I sit, and I wouldn't be sitting in Brussels if I didn't say the hot word simplification, because it's everywhere. And of course, this is also something that we are taking very, very seriously. You will have heard my Executive Vice President Virkkunen. It's like top priority for her. She has mandated everyone in Connect, and I'm telling you, it's happening. everything is on the table now. We're doing a proper review of everything around digital space. But as I'm also doing cybersecurity, I'm certainly also looking a little bit beyond what I have myself on my desk, looking at what are all the rules and regulations in place, whether it's sectorial or horizontal, or something to say, where do we find cybersecurity requirements? How do all of these things actually fit with what we have in our frameworks? Are there overlaps? Are there places where we can reduce the burden? And we're having very good discussions, of course, with our industry around this as well. And I'm really happy for people to come with concrete things, not just telling me that everything is bad, but concrete things that we can fix, because the door is very, very open for this right now.
Okay. When we come to you, Casper, somebody is in the private sector now. You've hopped the fence somewhat, former tech ambassador for Denmark. Tell me, is this what you feel? Is innovation, is simplification something you can feel coming in the commercial world for Zscaler today?
I thought this panel was about Greenland. No, it's a bad joke when you're Danish, and sorry to have two Danes in front of you. But Christiane is so desperate to be on panels with me that she follows me around the world to these kind of interventions. Listen, I think it's great, and I'll tease Christiane a little bit, to have the European Commission talk about simplification. And of course, it is sort of the buzzword of today. And let's be honest, for good reasons, because I do think that Europe is sort of at a critical time and space. In the private sector, we often talk about the importance of a level playing field. You would talk about, equal implementation across EU 27. But I think the problem right now is, of course, you don't have geopolitical level playing field. It's a very different situation right now. And Europe is under pressure. I think there is a sense here in Europe, I'm European with a capital E, that we can no longer trust the transatlantic relationship the way we used to trust it. And I think it creates a whole set of unprecedented challenges for all of us. I'll come back to the simplification process in a second, but I do want to say, having been in sort of the diplomatic world or in foreign ministries in the European Union and NATO myself, I think people often underestimate how dramatic a change in the psychology and the mindset of people we've seen in the last 3 to 4 months. I have to say, I think when you travel in Europe, and it's great to have Alina here and Sipa here, when you speak to European decision makers, of course politicians, but even in the private sector, the way they think about Europe right now, the way they think about sovereignty, the way they think about autonomy, and the way, unfortunately for those of us with a very big transatlantic heart, the way they think about the US as a partner is fundamentally different compared to anything we've seen before. And I think that puts a lot of things in question. I think for the European Union, how can we do a lot more on our own? And I think the efforts of the European Commission or the European institutions are necessary. They might be a little bit late because we don't have this blooming technology industry in Europe, but better late than never. But I also think, and of course I get my salary to say that, I think it puts in question sort of fundamental aspects about the ability of responsible US technology companies operating in Europe on European terms and supplying into the digital sovereignty space. That has become much more difficult in the last couple of months. We understand why, but some of us are a bit concerned about what that means for the transatlantic partnership, but also what it means in terms of European resilience at a moment where, as we've just heard, the threats against Europe are pretty high and unprecedented as well.
Okay, and Tomi, that sort of leads into, I mean, you mentioned Greenland, which we're not going to talk about in any great detail here, but I mean, it's part of a wider conversation. We partnered with Wilfred Martin Centre on a report on the TTC, for instance, which is no more as it stands, but it was a Trade and Technology Council. It was something it was an attempt for transatlantic cooperation at a time, and it operated and it worked. Where do you see, does what Casper said, does that ring true for you? Does it change in the last 3 months? And where do you see this transatlantic work go from here?
I will come back to Greenland. No, thank you. First of all, thank you, Seppa. Thank you, Alina, having this possibility to continue discussion. Indeed, with Seppa, Marta, we published a paper on TTC. You're saying it's totally dead. I think that's not totally the case. But I think that's the question which direction we go. I think on that, on TTC, to kind of continue where we stopped last time, is that I think there's a good news and bad news. I think the good news is that I think what we presented, so everybody remembers we had the catastrophe of TTIP. then we understood that, okay, let's make it, well, as those who are involved in trade, they know that what you speak in a political level is very different what happens in the trade negotiations. Let's go more technical, little bit off the radar. And then we had 10 working groups and all of that. And then the SEPA Martens Center point was that, okay, listen, you need to be a little bit more concrete, have a concrete projects, a little bit more mandate, try to maybe upgrade it time to time, maybe have even summits and include different actors. And what, one could say that's all these reasons why TTDC was formed, a little bit have an early warning system of the problems in the trade, also a little bit handle the first Trump administration dynamic. I think it's very valid, and I think that remains. So that's the good news. Now the bad news, Greenland. So basically the whole political situation, we know that now as the trade negotiations are going on about the percentage, all these institutions and the councils do not matter at the moment. I think they expect but then you could think that, okay, we have this situation going on, let's wait that the dust will settle and then we go back business as usual, we model these discussions in the council. But there's several issues. I think at least here in the Brussels side, the feeling is, first of all, and please, if there's somebody who can, challenge me, please feel welcome, that at least from the US side, there is no much will to continue with this TTDC. So they don't see it very positively from our side. In use, well, there's many, depending who you speak. There is one view that very much this China topic came because the setting, of course, China was one of the issues to be discussed in the TTDC, but that seemed to come through very, very forcefully. Third problem is the challenge is that very clearly during last, as you mentioned, last 1-2 years, this geopolitics has, connected very strong to trade. So it's very difficult then to deal with issues in a kind of technical platform. So to conclude, so what could happen? I would argue that the whole concept is good, especially with our SEPA Martens Center advice. It would be even better. But realistically, you have to relaunch the concept somehow. I don't know, make it Trump, trade, technology, defense council, and take it from there. You kind of need to revamp it and take it from there. But I think we should argue it's an important platform. We should continue with that.
Oh, thank you, Tomi. And Lucinda, I think there's the transatlantic relationship and there's what can happen there on both sides and what that means for European competitiveness and so on. But there's also what Europe has to do for itself. Yeah. And we have several reports on the table from one Finnish to Italian for politicians, the Draghi report, the Letter report, and so on. What can Europe do for itself? And you can address, if you wish, what we should be doing and could be doing on the transatlantic front. And I would add, Alina mentioned it earlier, we've hosted several events this week of the grouping from the S&D, or a delegation of the S&D grouping from Parliament with us in Washington on Tuesday, and we hosted a panel with the EU ambassador on Monday. There is a tension there. There's a tension. So go ahead.
I think yes, that's probably a slight understatement, but it's a good starting point. I mean, I think a few things. I think obviously, when we gather in these sort of environments, we tend to focus on the geopolitical broad environment and how it's changing and has changed, and we're all aware of that. And there's obviously a big focus on what's happening in Washington, because not least it's a great reality TV show and it's highly entertaining, if obviously massively concerning. But actually, politics has changed here in Europe as well, and I think that's really important to put it in context. There are similar dynamics, maybe not as pronounced in Europe as we have seen in the US. And we've had some quite controversial elections here in Europe. We have seen changes in EU member states, and we've seen major change in the European Commission and indeed in the Parliament in terms of the political leadership. So it's, the irony is that the mood music here in Europe should be a lot more, I would say, at least objectively, much more pro-Atlanticist. We have a very pro-innovation, a very pro-business sort of outlook that perhaps has been slightly lacking for the last 5 years, I would argue. And actually the drive now from, we'll say the greater representation of the centre-right in the European Commission, that changes the dynamic. And you see it reflected in the priorities of the Commission, and you see it in some of the calls coming from the Parliament. And there are really interesting dynamics even towards the end of the last Commission, where the Parliament was actually calling out the Commission in certain policy areas and certain initiatives, saying you need to listen to industry, you need to be more responsive. That's a change, because I think a lot of people here who've been in the lobbying business or who've been in the policy churn for a long time would say it's usually the opposite way around. Okay, so that should be a real positive, and it should be a moment where the European Union is coming together to sort of work constructively with the US on a lot of the things that we have mutual concerns about, like China, like competitiveness, like relevance in this changing geopolitical environment, and the value and the need for the transatlantic sort of cohesion that we would like to see. But things changed on January 20th, and we don't need to get into some of the rhetoric that has caused a lot of sort of emotional, I would say, and emotive response here in Europe, and has definitely seen a breakdown in trust at a moment when actually trust should be at an all-time high. So it's really unfortunate. All is not lost, I would say. The other obvious context is the war in Ukraine, and Europe, irrespective of what's happening in Washington, and I think the legitimate demands for Europe to do more to secure itself, to defend itself, and to be innovative, is that Europe is talking about this anyway. So the war in Ukraine has changed the context. Governments have been spending more and have been committing to spend more on the collective European security and defence. And these conversations are changed. It's reflected in new members of NATO. I mean, in Finland and Sweden joining NATO, something that has been a long-standing political discourse in those countries, but it took, the invasion of Ukraine and the fallout from that to actually see this actually happen. And the debates have changed in all of the other countries as well, including the neutrals. And let's not forget that we have neutrals. I'm from one of them, who are now procuring and spending a lot more on their own and collective European security and defence. And I think that that's an interesting sort of thing that is happening organically, irrespective of what's happening in Washington. And then we get to the broad competitiveness agenda, the Draghi report. And that, again, is focusing on things that, some of us have been arguing Europe has taken its eye off and really needs to refocus on. And that is our own security, cyber, and sort of traditional security and defence, innovation and spending on innovation. And this is where sometimes the rhetoric is mismatched with the reality, because we have big ambitions, and I think there's a lot of political buy-in in Europe, in the institutions and in the member state governments. You've seen a big shift in some of the larger member states. I'm thinking of France particularly, where President Macron, I think it's fair to say the French have been the drivers of a lot of this regulatory agenda, this discussion of strategic autonomy, which some interpret as, protectionism. And actually, President Macron has completely changed his rhetoric on this. And we're seeing a lot more openness to a collective European response to, supporting innovation and so on, aligned with Draghi and embracing what Draghi has proposed for the European Union. But the devil is in the detail. And this is where the challenge is. And I have great sympathy for friends and colleagues working in the European institutions trying to square that circle, where, we have this collective ambition, but different member states have different interpretations of how that will be achieved. And when you get into the detail of the regulatory frameworks, you get into the detail of simplification, that's where the battles really start to kick off. There's a lot more I could say on that, but I think that's just maybe to frame it in terms of, a lot of this sort of change that's being demanded from Washington, from Europe, is happening anyway. We need to accelerate it. We have big targets. There's 800 800 billion committed for investment in security and defence. How do we roll that out? How do we mobilise it? How do we ensure it doesn't get locked into that research side without the deployment and the everything Lawrence has spoken about, which is absolutely correct. But at the same time, we do need to invest in R&D, and that's very clear in Draghi. But there's a lot that can happen without all of that huge expenditure, and a massive part of that is nobody wants to call it deregulation. That's what we're talking about. We need to deregulate in Europe. We have overregulated across all sectors. And how do we do that? But while ensuring that we can have better symmetry between member states within the single market. That again is really challenging. It's easy to say in theory, much more difficult to achieve in reality.
Yeah, and I'll come back to you about that in a second, Christiane. But Tomi, I think you wanted to come in there on.
Yeah.
Lucinda's comments.
Actually, second, what Lucinda and Casper spoke about trust, because that's what we were speaking about current transatlantic relations. What is very striking is that in Washington, I think what Casper said, that change here in Europe is not fully understood. I think it's understandable. I think in Washington bubble, many of them are, has lost jobs. They are fighting the funding of their organization. The focus is on domestic politics. But I have to really just give a concrete example. I had a discussion with somebody from Heritage Foundation, which it's a little bit notorious, close to Trump world. But the person, quite high level, was astonished to learn that, give an example, Finland, as you mentioned, has now joined the NATO, European Union, of course, but NATO, and it's fully committed very much on transatlantic, also US relation, etc. But the fact is that 70% of the population thinks that if we have a war, and they're preparing for that, if we have war, the US will not come. US will not come. And so this person was like, how can this be? How can this be? And so that one point, and exactly as Lucinda said, that I think the irony of the situation is that we have a lot of elements, like in the, here in our bubble, you have a, new commission, which is more open. We know the difference between what happens and the rhetoric, but, deregulation, and I would claim also the current Henna Virkkunen, is much more, very pragmatic. And then, as mentioned, you have the whole defense issue, also going back to the TTTC. So you have, we are saving now we're kind of undoing Brexit with this whole defense cooperation topic. So that should be very natural platform, also with relations with the United States. So it's a pity that we're losing a lot of energy now because of this rhetorics.
No, thank you, Tomi. To bring it back to what's being done and what will be done here in Brussels, and as Lucinda alluded to, a lot of this was happening anyway. And maybe I'd be guilty of this myself, sort of teenage reaction. I was going to do that anyway. Don't tell me to do it, That's not an excuse. We can still get on with the business. If for Europe to be competitive, particularly when it comes to technology, and the competitive compass has set some ambitious targets in that regard. There's talk about sovereignty. There's talking about building European champions. But in practical terms, there's no path forward that doesn't involve suppliers from outside the EU, particularly from the US when it comes to things like AI and cloud. How do you factor that in? And I'm assuming US firms aren't a problem for the future of your plans for competitiveness. How do you factor all that in?
I think, the way, of course, we're working on this now is that, we remain an open economy. I think our line has always been that we set requirements, we set the standards, we define, if you're coming from a security perspective, we are also looking at what are the security requirements. There are areas where, of course, there's an interest to have European companies, especially for specifically very sensitive sectors, as we already see, there's nothing new there. And I think the way we're looking at it is also to say, but of course, companies that meet these requirements that we can trust, these are the ones where, they're always welcome. And I think there's a lot of discussion going around that. I think what Casper is also referring to, I think it's not so much necessarily at the policy level or the political level, but what is happening when he goes to see his vendors, right? Or the people who buy from him. I think that's where you have maybe also a very big shift of mindset, because for our side, of course, we set the frameworks, we set the rules. That is one part. The other part is, I think there is, especially, I look at it, of course, in the security field, and more specifically cybersecurity, cyber defense, it's an area where we practically do not have industry. Very, very little European industries in this field. And it is a resilience issue. that we don't have European industry here. We need to also be able to draw on our own industry. And I think for me, this fits very well into the whole discussion around also us taking charge of our own security. It means that we have to be able to also rely on companies. We see when we have very, very big, large-scale incidents, and we've seen them in the past, they're really big ones, right? They rock the world. So we need to be able to ensure that we have the capacity here, because we cannot expect, certain companies, like everyone will have their own market they will have to look after. We need to also have the capacity in Europe to deal with these things. We need to have the reserve in Europe to be able to deal if there is a very large incident. And I think those are the things that we also need to think about when we have our discussions around preparedness, when we have our discussions around resilience. We need to factor in, this level of being sure that we can also deliver for our own critical entities.
Yeah, okay, Casper, you want to?
Well, I mean, just a couple of points on this. I mean, I think, if I wasn't clear before, let me be crystal clear, as Christiane helped me on this one. Yes, it's not only a political or public sector phenomena. I mean, we're hearing this from our customers, including big customers in Europe. And there are two things they're saying to us, and bear with me for a second. One is, of course, the obvious concern about US technology per se. That's the obvious one. Trump administration, the dialogue that is ongoing, naturally it has an impact on customers or companies in Europe as well. The other one, which is very interesting, is the political risk associated with buying US technology. And of course, those two things are related, but it's not completely the same, which means that especially, not least in the public sector, you have high-level decision makers that are afraid of going down the US technology road because of political concerns in terms of what risk it entails for them to take those decisions. And I think that says a little bit about how different the environment is right now in Europe. Now, what do we do about it? And, needless to say, I will have to say what I'm going to say now, so I know that I have no credibility, but I will do it nonetheless. What we would like to see in Europe, and where we're hoping that Christiane and Virkunen and others will help, is to allow nuances and differentiation when you look at the market in Europe. What I'm saying here is, of course, the companies that adhere to supporting digital sovereignty, control, making sure data sets are not, violated, distributed. And what I think is the most important thing these days, I mean, we've been talking about, and colleagues in uniform or previously in uniform will know this very well. Of course, a lot of concerns about intelligence access to personal data sets in Europe. That's still, of course, a discussion point. But these days, I would argue that risks or concerns around traditional espionage is moving up the ladder. European customers, European companies are incredibly concerned about whether their data sets are going to be misused, monetized, innovated on the basis of outside the European Union. So what we're hoping for is, of course, those companies that can offer that kind of ring fencing, protection. In our case, we do not share or keep the content of our customers. They will be allowed to operate in Europe. And the last thing, which is a controversial point to mention here, I hope that I will get an ice cream from Christiane after this. I actually think in order to progress digital sovereignty, in some areas you need more regulation. I'm willing to go into a bet here on whatever drinking subject you would like to go into. I think it's going to be very difficult for the European Commission to avoid introducing new regulation in order to promote autonomy or digital sovereignty. Because, of course, what does this entail to promote European industry? Well, you need to partner up with European companies. You need to make sure you share innovations. You need to make sure you share technologies. You need to make sure it's crystal clear that you do not misuse data sets. How do you do that on a voluntary basis? I stand to be corrected. In my view, you will see introductions of new regulations to try and promote digital sovereignty. I know Christiane is going to disagree with me on this one, but let's meet again in 5 years' time and see who was right.
Okay, well, let's hope we don't have to wait 5 years to find anything out here. I mean, we're going to go for Q&A very briefly, but Lucinda, I might come back to you. I want to just quote directly from our previous speaker to the keynote, Lorenz here from Auterion. If you want to build an industry, you have to buy from it. And that sounds an awful lot like adoption to me. I mean, the adoption gap is a concern, I think, in lots of fronts. We've heard stats mentioned when it comes to AI, but technology in general, cloud adoption, etc. I'm assuming you don't agree that new regulation is the way forward there. There is money in a pot from COVID that still hasn't been spent on lots of fronts. What would you like to see the Commission do to move that along in Europe in general, and the member states who are responsible for their own work as well?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think it's wrong to frame this as an either or option. So I think if you come at this from the competitiveness and innovation standpoint, for just from through that lens, if you like, it makes sense to want to support an ecosystem which allows new technologies, dual-use technologies, deep tech, etc., to thrive in Europe. That's logical. But I think that there are a couple of factors to that. It's not as simple as deciding, well, we're going to regulate to make it happen, or we're going to spend a lot of public funds to make it happen. It's simply, if it were that simple, it would have happened already. We've all sorts of programs under our multi-annual financial frameworks going back decades that have sort of tried to achieve that, but it hasn't happened. And there are a couple of factors. One is culture, risk. So we are as Europeans more averse to risk than our US counterparts. That's a fact, and that's something that I think has to be incentivized and encouraged. We are dependent, so that's the starting point. We are dependent on US technology. So for European technology to flourish, we have no alternative but to work with and adopt US technology, both civilian and in the military sphere. So I think that's an incontrovertible fact as well. And the other point is capital. So I alluded to the Draghi proposal, some of which is around deregulation and is eminently logical and sensible and relatively cost-free. The other is, ramping up significant public investment, which needs to happen and will happen. And I mean, it would require a multi-annual financial framework to increase about sevenfold. That's what's so currently the 7-year multi-annual financial framework is about 1.4 trillion. And under the Draghi proposals, that will have to increase dramatically. So that's needed. But the other point is that we have a complete lack of capital in Europe. So Capital Markets Union is a chimera that we have all aspired to, and we've talked about it since I was Minister for European Affairs during the financial crisis, where I attended every EU summit, banking union, capital markets union, all of this, and it hasn't materialized. And that's, again, it's because while we all have these big common ambitions, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, there are sovereignty issues dressed up, if you like, as maybe protectionist. It depends on your perspective, I suppose. But the fact is that we haven't been able to reach political agreement. Now we have a bit more imperative for it, and we have Draghi, that report sort of pushing. So let's see. And we've changed the name. It's no longer Capital Markets Union, so maybe that helps. But that is important. We need to mobilize private capital to work with the public, and we cannot achieve these goals if we don't do that. So if we want to innovate and if we want to build these digital capabilities in Europe, we need that capital to emerge. And just one interesting, stat is that, the sort of purchasing power of average Europeans is about 30% less than the US, but we have far more savings in Europe. But we can't mobilize those savings through pension funds and through investment tools. So these are really important questions. We can have all of the regulation and all of the aspiration that we want, but if we cannot fund these ambitions, we'll still be here. We will still be here in 5 years talking about this. So this is the challenge for the Eurogroup, for my good friend Pascal Donoghue in his role as Eurogroup president, and for the Commission and all of the member state capitals working together. But hopefully, the global uncertainty that we are experiencing, the negatives that we are seeing in the transatlantic relationship might just spur some of this to happen more rapidly. And certainly that's my silver lining in all of this, is that I feel that this impetus is here now with us here in Brussels in particular, but also in the other European capitals. A final point I'd like to make, sort of unconnected, is it's great to see Chancellor Merz in Washington today. This is really positive. As we all know, he's an Atlanticist. He believes in the relationship. It's very broken from the German perspective at the moment, but this is an important move. But I really want to see the president of the Commission sitting in the Oval Office, meeting with...
I think she wants as well.
Yeah. But we've got to push for this to happen. Okay. I think that talking about transatlantic tech dialogue, talking about some of the ability for Europe to bring some of what's happening on the European table to Washington, explaining it at a political level, it really requires that engagement between the President of the United States and the President of the Commission.
I'm going to go for questions because we are a little over time. Is there anybody who wants to ask you? Oh, very good, very good. Lieutenant General, everyone to stand to attention, please.
At ease, thank you. Two easy questions. We see what's happening in Ukraine. We see that Ukrainians have been able to maintain basically the state and run it during the war. Isn't it time that in the European Union we also start regulating how we're going to operate in crisis and war, start creating those crisis response measures, and what would be the role of the EU if this war is waged by NATO or by coalition of the willing and so on? Very hot topic, but I think maybe another red line that we should cross and stop talking about. And the second question is, let me think. Okay, isn't it also a time to start, I asked it yesterday already, that the EU is using great lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to promote and foster and explain what's happening and what are the interests in Europe, why we're doing certain things they're doing. Potentially, I would think also about engaging the social media more so that average Americans know more about European Union and so on. Because I think, from my experience, this is the best way. It costs money. Sometimes there are some political issues. Okay, why am I using the lobbyist? But a lot of countries are doing it. Thank you.
Well, I know it's not necessarily for DG Connect to make the decisions, and you can if you don't want to answer it, that's absolutely fine, Christiane. But maybe the first question, because there is a cybersecurity question there to start.
And there's also a digital government question there, which is very important and which actually we also have to deal with in DG Connect and in my directorate. We're looking with very great interest, and we're talking a lot with the Ministry of Digital and the people of Europe in terms of how do you build a resilient government, because actually it's extremely interesting what they have used. They're using this DIA wallet technology in order to ensure that government continues, that they have payments, they build it. It's amazing what they have done. And this is something that we are very much trying to build also in Europe with having, our digital wallet infrastructures. So I would say the seeds are there, we're building it, and we're engaging a lot with the Ukrainians around this. They're also participating in our pilots and so on, because we really want to use their experience. Overall, beyond the operations of government, you will have seen in the Ninista report, you will have seen a lot of ideas coming there, replicated also and shaped in our preparedness union strategy. And when we're looking across the board, it's a very rich strategy, but one of the places where it's, pushing us as institutions, but also the member states, is like we have to be able to think worst case scenario. We've not been good enough at that, right? We've been brought up in peacetime. I've never seen anything bad in my life. It shapes our minds. We have to be able to have these difficult conversations. And we have to be able to also look at, all the things I'm doing in cybersecurity. It cannot only be that I'm working against a peacetime scenario when I do these, right? I do risk assessments, for instance. We go around and look at our critical supply chains. Where do we have risk of disruption? Where do we have, where do we see pre-positioning? All of these things. We have to be able to work and think in a worst case scenario, what does that mean for our port security? What does it mean for our, capacity to move troops, etc.? These are all things that as civilians, and those of us who are working on the civilian side, we really need to start thinking about. And this is the work that we're rolling out now as well, very much also fueled by the preparedness strategy.
Thank you. And I'm going to go very quickly because we will run through the lobbying question in Washington. Should it be done? Should the EU be doing it?
Okay, one point. Okay, well,
Very quick, very quickly, Tomi.
On
We're out
only
of time.
that, let's put it this way. I think there it was a good point because there we have job to do. Just when I had a bit luck to participate, discussion. My big surprise was how in White House, how ideological it is about European Union. That was really, I thought it was just, arguments and one-liners, but my impression is that at least this moment, there's a kind of this ideological resistance for European Union, and it's somehow reflected in our discussion. So I think to bring explain the European Union advantages cooperating with European Union, I think there's a long way to go. I hope that this will change now that there's some kind of rebalancing reality check in Washington, White House also, and when the economic numbers start to come in and maybe reactions and the midterms are approaching, but there's a very long way to go.
Thank you, Tomi. Casper, you want to come in very quickly?
Super quick to your question or your point, General. I think the perception of the European Union or Europe is a bit flawed currently in other parts of the world. I'm not going to speak about lobbyists, but I do think there is a question that you should also be asking the private sector, which is, who are you and what do you believe in and what are you prepared to defend and protect? And I think it's very difficult for the private sector to remain the Switzerlands or the Irelands of this world. In other words, to be neutral right now. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of months is quite disappointing. Very few companies have actually stood up and been the custodians of the transatlantic relationship at a time of political turmoil. I think we need to expect that from companies. That's part of being responsible. And I think that is part of what you can do to try and convince the US administration that they need to maintain a close ally and partner with Europe right now.
Thanks, Casper. Final word to you, Lucinda.
Well, I haven't spoken for the Irish government in over 10 years, but I will say that Ireland is militarily neutral, but certainly not neutral when it comes to values and defence of our values. So that's all. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I think we say thank you very much to our panel for today.